Hello everyone and welcome to today's video, which is another part of my Christmas in July add-on series. And this video today is all about belly band closures and then also tuck spot closures as well as pocket closures. And the first add-on style I chose with a belly band closure is of course this regular belly band. So that's exactly how I would use a belly band on my page styles as well. So it's a very simple add-on style, but it's still fun to use. So what you can do here is you can just take your photos or photo mats or photo booklets and just slide them underneath the belly band. And then for decoration, I always like to add something in the middle of the belly band. So that's what I did here. I just used a journaling card from the collection and I backed it onto some cardstock, which I cut out with my scallop frame die cut. And then I just glued it to the middle. And then the second style is a style with a belly band which you could just take off completely. So you would just slide it to the top or the bottom and take it off. And then you have this double gatefold style, which I really like. So you could just open it up like a gatefold and then you have room for a 4x6-inch photo in the middle. And then on the sides, I would probably do some journaling as well. And I really love how this add-on style turned out. So especially with the decoration, I don't know, like this pattern paper on the gatefold is just perfect for this style. So that's also what I would do sometimes. So sometimes I would have a look at my decorative elements or pattern papers I have. And then that's how I choose my page styles or add-on styles. So these stripes with a star pattern here are just the perfect size to add to these two gatefold sides. And then as you can see, I again added something to the middle of the belly band, which is another journaling card and a scallop frame die cut. Now for the second closure, I chose to include tuck spots because with tuck spots you would also be able to close up a photo booklet or any like add-on style. So as you can see here, I used this scallop frame die cut with a journaling card as a tuck spot, and then you would be able to just tuck in your photo mats behind this tuck spot. And this one actually might be a little too large, so you could even do it a little like smaller so it would be easier to tuck it in. But yeah, I really wanted to use this journaling card, so I used this and it still works fine. So you have to bend the photo mats a little, but yeah, nothing is getting broken by bending it, so that's totally fine, and I really like how it turned out. And then the next add-on style I chose to include for this closure type is this booklet, which has kind of a buckle here. So you could actually use this and then tuck it in to close it up. And as you can see, it has room for 6 different 4x6-inch photos. Now, the idea behind the next closure type is that you would be able to close an add-on style by using some pockets. So as you can see, the first add-on style with a pocket closure I included here is this gatefold, which has 2 corner pockets. So you would be able to open it up by actually getting out this 4x6-inch photo mat. So that's what's inside the pockets. And then once you have taken it out, you would be able to open up the gatefold, and this leaves you room for one 4x6-inch photo and then also for some journaling on the sides of the gatefold. And another idea for using a pocket for a closure is this bottom pocket. So I added the pocket here to the bottom, and then you can remove another photo mat, which is also a 4x6 inch photo mat, and then you would be able to open up your booklet. And as you can see, you could add 4 different 4x6 inch photos here as well, but then of course you would also be able to add a photo to the back side of the 4x6 inch photo mat here. Okay, so now we can start with the 6 tutorials for these different add-on styles I shared with you. And as always, you want to start with cutting down your cardstock and pattern paper elements. And for the measurements, you can actually get the cutting guides and templates in my Etsy store, and really they make it super easy to actually build those add-on styles. And when you cut your elements according to the cutting guide, I would also suggest to label them, so you find the letters for each element on the cutting guides as well. And with labeling, it makes it super easy to follow along with this video tutorial. And for a lot of those cardstock elements, there is also scoring required. So after cutting them down, you would also need to score your cardstock. And again, with the templates, it's really easy to see where to score your cardstock elements and which cardstock elements actually need scoring. Now for the first add-on style, which is a very simple add-on style, we only need cardstock element A and B. And then you want to attach some 3/8 of an inch tape to the back side of cardstock element B, and we want to attach it on the bottom and the top of the cardstock. And then we can attach pattern paper A onto cardstock element A. And for attaching pattern paper, I always like using wet glue instead of tape, because when we're using wet glue, you're still able to move around the pattern paper for a few seconds until you find the right position to place your pattern paper in. After covering cardstock element A with pattern paper A, we can then also attach cardstock element B, and I want to attach it in the middle of my cardstock element A. However, I don't use my ruler here, so as you can see, I just eyeball it. If you want to use your ruler, you can of course do that first to find the middle, and then I carefully stick it down and just use my bone folder to also burnish it down. And then for the last step, we only need to attach pattern paper B onto cardstock element B. So again, I use my wet glue here. And then I decided that I also want to decorate the belly band a little more, so I got a journaling card from the collection and I backed it onto some cardstock, which I cut out by using a scallop frame die cut. And as you can see, I just used some wet glue here as well to place it in the middle of the belly band. The first step for the next add-on style is to place some tape right next to the scoring lines onto cardstock elements B. So as you can see, I again use my 3/8 of an inch tape and I just place it right next to the scoring lines. But you don't want to cover up the scoring lines, so be careful that you just place it next to it. And then you can get your scissors and just turn around your cardstock and cut off the corners. So as you can see, I cut at an angle, and I do that on both cardstock elements B. And then after cutting the corners, we can also fold up this little flap we have created with scoring, and you also want to fold it up on the back side. So as you can see, I just fold it up and then I use my bone folder to burnish it down. And then we also need to fold along the second scoring line, which is more in the middle of cardstock element B. And for this, you want to do that on the front side of cardstock element B. So again, I think it's very helpful to label your cardstock elements so that you know which one is the front and which one is the back side. So turn it around again and then fold your cardstock on the second scoring line. And then we can continue with attaching cardstock elements B onto cardstock element A. And for attaching cardstock elements, I always like to remove just half of the tape backing from one side. And then I hold up the sticky side and I use the non-sticky side to align my cardstock with the edge of cardstock element A, which is underneath. And then I make sure that it's in the right position. And once I have found the right position and it's aligned with the edges, I go ahead and remove the rest of the tape backing to place my cardstock in the right position. And then for attaching the second cardstock element B, I do the same. However, I like to hold my first cardstock element B, which is already attached, in place so that I can align the second one with the edge of the first one. And then the next step would be to cover cardstock elements B with pattern papers B. So I got my pattern papers here, and again I use wet glue instead of tape so that I'm still able to move around my pattern paper and find the right position so that I have an even border of cardstock around it. And then I stick down my pattern papers before I continue with the next step. Now we need to build our cardstock element C, which we want to place as a belly band around our construction here. So I already have one scoring line, and what I like to do now is I fold along the scoring line on the back side of cardstock element C, and then I slide my construction against the scoring line, and then I do a second scoring line by not using my scoreboard but instead just folding it against cardstock elements A and B so that it's a very tight fit. And now for closing this belly band, I use some 3/8 of an inch tape and I place it on the bottom of cardstock element C, but you could also use some wet glue instead if you prefer wet glue here. And then again, I just place the belly band around my construction, and then I remove the tape backing and I make sure that it's straight, and then I just stick it in place. And then there's only one step left to do to finish up this add-on style, which would be to attach the pattern paper C onto cardstock element C. And again, for attaching pattern paper, I like using wet glue. Now this add-on style is finished, but you can of course also go ahead and decorate the belly band a little more. So that's what I'm doing here. So again, I got one of my journaling cards from the collection and I backed it onto some cardstock, which I cut out with a scalloped frame die cut. Now let's continue with the next add-on style, and for this add-on style we first would need to attach some 3/8 of an inch tape right next to the scoring line on cardstock element B. So be careful that you don't accidentally cover up the scoring line, but just place it right next to it. And then once you have attached your tape, you can turn around the cardstock to cut the corners. So I get my scissors here and I cut the corners at an angle also right next to the scoring lines. You don't want to cut into the scoring lines. And then you can fold up this little flap we have created, and you want to do that on the back side of the cardstock. So that's why it is important that you label your cardstock so that you know which side is the back and which one is the front. And then we also need to fold the cardstock along the second scoring line. So again, you want to do that on the back side as well. And now cardstock element B is ready to be attached onto cardstock element A. And for attaching cardstock, I like to just remove half of the tape backing from one side, and then I hold up the sticky side and I use the non-sticky side to align my cardstock with the edge of the cardstock which is underneath. So in this case, with the edge of cardstock element A, so that it's perfectly straight. And then we can cover up cardstock element B with some pattern paper, so we can get pattern paper B. And I also decided that I want the corners to be decorated a little, so I got my corner punching tool and I actually just used it on the front of pattern paper B. And then I got my wet glue and I just attached it onto cardstock element B. And then we can also attach pattern paper A onto cardstock element A. So this pattern paper piece is just going to be attached on the bottom of cardstock element A. So as you can see, I again use my wet glue here and I just stick it down. And then for the last step, you would need any kind of like die cut piece, or you could also use a chipboard from the collection or a sticker. But if you're using a sticker, I would recommend to back it onto some cardstock. So I'm using a cardstock piece here, which I cut out with a die cut, and I also backed it on the same piece so that it's a little thicker. And then for attaching, I use some foam tape here. So I place the foam tape on the bottom of this die cut piece, and then I just attach it to the middle of cardstock element A. And to start with the next add-on style, we just need cardstock elements B and some 3/8 of an inch tape. And as you can see, I just place my tape right next to the scoring lines on cardstock element B. And then I turn around my cardstock and I use my scissors to cut off the corners at an angle. And you also want to do that right next to the scoring lines and don't actually cut into the scoring lines. And then we also need to fold up those little flaps on cardstock element B, and we want to do that on the back side. So that's not the side you have labeled your cardstock. So turn around your cardstock and fold up those little flaps you have created and also burnish them down. And then we also need to attach some 3/8 of an inch tape onto cardstock element C, but this time we don't want to attach it on the front side of cardstock element C, so that's the side you labeled your cardstock at, but you want to attach the tape on the back side. And then for some reason I didn't film it, but you would of course also need to fold up the little flap we have created here on cardstock element C. And we also want to do that on the back side. So just go ahead and fold up the little flap. And then there's also cardstock element D, which we want to attach some 3/8 of an inch tape to. So again, I just place it right next to the scoring lines, and actually it doesn't really matter if you place it on the front or on the back side. And here you don't want to cut the corners at an angle, just make sure to cut off the tape excess hanging from the edges if there's any. And then we can attach cardstock elements B onto cardstock element A. And as you can see, I also folded cardstock element A in the middle on the back side. And that's also where you want to attach your cardstock elements B to. So you want to attach them to the back side, so to the inside of this little booklet. So again, I remove half of the tape backing from one side, and then I hold up the sticky side and I use the non-sticky side to align my cardstock with the edges. And make sure that when attaching cardstock elements B, that you actually place them right next to the scoring line of cardstock element A, and you don't cover up the scoring lines because you still want to be able to fold cardstock element A over those cardstock elements B. And in case you notice that cardstock elements B aren't folding so well on top of each other, you can still go ahead and trim one of those cardstock elements B just slightly so that it folds better. Now close up the construction by folding cardstock element B first, and then you can also fold down cardstock element A, and then you would need cardstock element C, which is the next cardstock element we want to attach. And to attach cardstock element C, I first just hold it in place, which means I fold it over the booklet on the open side of cardstock element A. And then I hold it in place, I carefully turn around my construction, and then I remove the tape backing of cardstock element C to stick it down. And then I also like to actually round the corners on cardstock element C, but this is of course optional, so you could just skip this step if you don't want to round the corners. But if you do so, you would of course also need to round the corners on cardstock element pattern paper C as well. Now for attaching pattern paper C onto cardstock element C, I like using white tape here because this cardstock element is supposed to be like tucked in later, and for this add-on style I prefer this to be added with tape so that it holds on really well and it sticks really well so that you can still bend it without the pattern paper getting any creases. So I just backed pattern paper C with tape, and then I got my scissors to actually cut off the excess of the tape, and then I also made sure that I burnish it down before removing the tape backing and carefully attaching it onto cardstock element C. Now we can also attach pattern paper A onto cardstock element A, and here again I decided to actually punch the corners. This time I didn't use my round punching tool, but instead I use these corner punching tool with the decorative corners, and then I just use some wet glue again to attach this pattern paper onto cardstock element A. And then I also add the coordinating pattern paper onto the last cardstock element we need to attach for this add-on style, which is cardstock element D and pattern paper D. So I attach pattern paper D onto cardstock element D, and then we can continue with attaching cardstock element D onto cardstock element A. And for attaching cardstock element D, I just removed the tape backing on both sides, and then I carefully hold it over cardstock element C, so I make sure that the scoring lines are right next to cardstock element C, and then I just stick it down, and now you would be able to tuck in cardstock element C. And that would be it for this add-on style, but I also wanted to decorate the corners a little, and I got my enamel dots to place them into the corners, but then also I placed 2 enamel dots onto cardstock element D. And to start with the next add-on style, we just need cardstock elements B and some 3/8 of an inch tape. And as you can see, I just place my tape right next to the scoring lines on cardstock element B. And then I turn around my cardstock and I use my scissors to cut off the corners at an angle. And you also want to do that right next to the scoring lines and don't actually cut into the scoring lines. And after cutting the corners, we can continue by folding up those cardstock elements B on the scoring lines, and we want to do that on the back side as well. So just fold up those little flaps we have created with scoring and use your bone folder to burnish it down. And then we also need to place some 3/8 of an inch tape next to the scoring lines on cardstock element C. And again, I make sure that I don't accidentally cover up the scoring lines when placing my tape. And then you can also cut the corners at an angle, and as you can see, I had already cut the corners of the cardstock off camera because I used my cutting machine here, but you don't have to do that. You can just use your scissors and then cut at an angle and make sure that you just cut right next to the scoring lines. And then for cardstock element C, we only need to also fold up the cardstock on the back side. So as you can see, I just fold up these little flaps, and again, I use my bone folder to burnish it down. And then we can continue with attaching cardstock elements B onto cardstock element A. And for attaching cardstock elements, I always like to remove just half of the tape backing from one side. And then I hold up the sticky side and I use the non-sticky side to align my cardstock with the edge of cardstock element A, which is underneath. And then once I have found the right position, I just remove the rest of the tape backing to stick it down. And then for attaching the second cardstock element B, I do the same. However, I like to hold my first cardstock element B, which is already attached, in place so that I can align the second one with the edge of the first one. Now that cardstock elements B are attached, we can also attach cardstock element C onto cardstock elements B. So these are the corner pockets which go on the bottom of cardstock elements B. And as you can see, I just removed the tape backing from the side, and then I hold up the side and I just align it with the bottom of the pocket, which is not sticky yet. And then once I've found the right position and I have it aligned, I remove the tape backing from the bottom of the pocket as well to stick it in place. And then we can cover up our cardstock elements with the coordinating pattern papers. So first I attach pattern paper C onto cardstock element C. And for attaching pattern paper, I always like using wet glue instead of tape so that I'm still able to move around my pattern paper and find the right position so that I have an even border of cardstock around it. And for pattern papers B, I actually just place some wet glue around the edges on the top and the sides, and then I carefully slide it into those corner pockets, and then I stick it down by also using my bone folder to burnish it down. Now we just need to add cardstock element D, which is placed into those corner pockets. And also we want to cover up cardstock element D with some pattern papers. So I got my pattern paper here, and then I decided to also round the corners. So that's what I'm doing for the cardstock as well as for the pattern paper, of course. And then, as you can see, I already decorated my pattern paper a little more by using some alphabet stickers from the collection saying Jolly. And then I again just use my wet glue to cover up my cardstock element D with the pattern paper D. Now to start with the last add-on style, we would need cardstock elements B and some 3/8 of an inch tape, which we want to place right next to the scoring lines on the cardstock. And then we just need to cut off the corners at an angle. Again, you want to do that right next to the scoring lines and don't actually cut into the scoring lines. And then we also need to fold up those little flaps on cardstock element B, and we want to do that on the back side. So that's not the side you have labeled your cardstock. So turn around your cardstock and fold up those little flaps you have created and also burnish them down. Now we can do the same for cardstock element C. So again, first you want to place your 3/8 of an inch tape right next to the scoring lines on cardstock element C. And then also turn around the cardstock to actually cut off the corners. And as you can see, I again cut at an angle, and I make sure that I just cut right next to the scoring lines. And we also need to fold up those little flaps we have created with scoring on each side on cardstock element C. And again, we want to do that on the back side of cardstock element C. And I also use my bone folder here to burnish it down. And then we can continue by attaching cardstock element C onto cardstock element A. And for attaching cardstock element C, I just remove half of the tape backing from the bottom of the pocket. And then I hold up the sticky side and I use the non-sticky side to align my pocket edges with cardstock element A underneath. And once I've found the right position, I remove the tape backing from the sides as well to stick it in place completely. After attaching cardstock element C, we can also attach cardstock elements B. And for attaching cardstock elements B, I also remove the tape backing just from one side, so just half of it. And then I hold up the sticky side and I actually press down cardstock element C so that I can make sure that I align cardstock element B with the opening of the pocket. So I don't want cardstock element B to fold over cardstock element C, but just fold nicely right next to it. And then of course we want to do exactly the same for the second cardstock element B, which is placed on the opposite side and also aligned to cardstock element C and then also to the edge of cardstock element A. And then we only need to add our pattern paper onto cardstock elements B and C. So I'm starting with the pattern paper B And again, I just use some wet glue to attach my pattern paper onto the cardstock element. And then once I have pattern paper B attached, I continue with the next pattern paper, which is pattern paper C. But I also decided to decorate the corners a little, so I use my corner punching tool here. I punch the corners first, and then I again use my wet glue to attach the pattern paper onto the pocket. And then for the last step, we just need to also cover up our cardstock element D with some pattern paper, and that's what I'm doing here. So I use my wet glue to attach my pattern paper D onto cardstock element D, and I also added a decorative element, so that's of course optional, but I liked to attach this scallop frame cardstock piece, which I used underneath one of the journaling cards as well. And that's it for today's video on these 3 closure types you could use in your projects. So I really hope that you enjoyed watching it, and I would love to see you back in my next video. Bye!